Despite all these unprecedented maneuvers, the elections of the year 5 between 21st March and 9 April took place amid the same public indifference that had characterized every election since 1791. Most of those qualified to vote in replacing the 234 or so former members of the convention now to retire by lot did not bother to do so. But the verdict of the electoral assemblies was nevertheless clear. They voted heavily against the convention and its legacy. Only 11 of the retiring deputies were re-elected. They voted too against Jacobinism. No clearly identifiable left-wing candidates were returned. Above all, they voted against the directory. Of those elected, 228 were without any previous political experience, but were still preferred to the trusted hacks the authorities had tried to favor. And 182 of them were royalists. That did not mean that they constituted a united party. They ranged from the most gradualist believers in a constitutional restoration to General Pichegru, who had been in sporadic contact with Louis XVIII's agents for almost 2 years over the prospects of a restoration by military coup. But their arrival destroyed the more or less stable majority on which the directors had been able to rely since the inauguration of the Constitution. For this reason alone, Rubel at once proposed the annulment of the elections. His colleagues felt, however, that the complexion of the new majority was by no means clear, and the first test of opinion confirmed the uncertainty. When it fell to Letourneur's lot to retire, the new councils elected Barthélemy, a career diplomat best known for negotiating the Peace of Basel in 1795. His constitutional convictions were unclear. He seems to have been chosen on the presumption that he would help to bring an end to the war. All these domestic convolutions took place, of course, against the background of Bonaparte's victories in Italy and even, at last, progress on the German front. The preliminaries of Leoben were signed on 18 April. The new councils convened on 20 May under their shadow, and the nature of the peace they were to produce became at once one of the central issues in politics. The desire for peace was general after 5 years of battling against the whole of Europe. When in July, the British offered to negotiate, the prospects for a general settlement seemed bright. Royalists believed that it would smooth the way towards a restoration, and to hasten the moment, they favored a conciliatory approach to both Austria and Great Britain. Pragmatists like Carnot and Barthélemy also realized that a peace without significant concessions was bound to be unstable. In any case, they believed that a working relationship must be developed with the new majority. But the other three directors, after characteristic initial wavering by Barras, feared that cooperation could only lead to a monarchist triumph. Pichegru had been elected president of the 500, and by this time the directors, though not the deputies, had received damning evidence from Bonaparte of his treasons. Nor did the Republic's more successful generals wish to see their conquests bartered away to bring in a king. That meant not only Bonaparte, but Hoche, who was as commander in the Netherlands, hoped to restore a prestige dented by the Irish debacle of the previous winter. Encouraged by Barras, Hoche moved troops within the constitutional belt around the capital in July. And under their eye on the 14th, the Directory, outvoting Carnot and Barthélemy, carried out a ministerial reshuffle which deliberately challenged the councils by removing the most prominent right-wingers. The triumvirs, as the right-wing press now dubbed Barras, Rebelle, and La Rêvelière, also began to make gestures towards Jacobinism. Babeuf had been finally convicted at Vendôme, and he and one other conspirator had gone to the guillotine on 27 May. They would be remembered as Jacobin martyrs, having, like those of Prairial, tried to kill themselves as soon as the verdict was pronounced. But most of the other accused had been acquitted, so it was possible now to close the episode and quietly rehabilitate less extreme forms of Jacobinism. but at any such gestures naturally alarmed the councils, who were busy discussing ways to circumscribe the Directory's financial powers and measures favorable to non-juror priests. Thus, tension between executive and legislature mounted over the summer, while the majority of a clearly divided Directory steadily drafted more and more troops into the Paris region. Late July, in fact, was marked by a surge of patriotic addresses from the Ummies professing loyalty to the Republic. And neither the Directory nor the generals did anything to discourage such overt partisanship. Bonaparte even told his men they would cross the Alps with an eagle's swiftness if the Republic should be threatened. Meanwhile, he dispatched one of his deputies, Augereau, to command the forces being assembled by the triumvirs. Desperately, Royalist leaders spent August trying to put together a counterforce, while the councils debated measures to revitalize the National Guard. Irregular bands of street fighters were recruited, and there were clashes with Augereau's troops. But in the face of so much accumulating force, the councils could do little but bluster. Thus, at the end of August, they finally approved the abrogation of all laws against refractory priests. The triumvirs took up the challenge. On the night of 3 to 4 September, which would be 17 to 18 Fructidor, year 5, they ordered the troops they had assembled to seize all strong points in Paris and surround the legislative chambers. They then issued orders for the arrest of Carnat, Barthélemy, 53 deputies, including Pichegru, and several other prominent members of the right. They also closed down some 30 newspapers. These measures were confirmed by a hand-picked quorum of deputies from both councils meeting under military surveillance. Meanwhile, the city was plastered with a proclamation denouncing royalist machinations and publicizing for the first time the treason of Pichegru. There was no resistance. The coup was practically bloodless. As soon as it was over, the purged councils annulled the results of the spring elections in 49 departments, leaving 177 vacant seats. The vacant posts on the Directory were filled by François de Neufchâteau, a noted anti-clerical, and Merlin de Douai, one of the chief architects of the Constitution, which the coup of Fructidor had in effect destroyed. Whether it saved France from a restoration seems improbable. although it undoubtedly thwarted the grand design of certain British-backed royalist agents like the ex-magistrate and deputy D'André, who hoped to achieve a peaceful recall of the pretender by a legislative majority, but built up over several elections and tireless cultivation of moderate opinion. The very number of its victims shows that no sort of royalist majority yet existed. It is quite likely, as Carnot had hoped, that a working relationship could have been established between the Directory and a moderate Republican majority. But the triumvirs dreaded a conspiracy, and the generals feared and despised all moderates. They combined, therefore, to destroy the Constitution before it had weathered the first real test. From now on, although legal forms would continue to be observed, the Second Directory would no hesitate to rig or set aside any results that proved inconvenient. They thereby proclaimed that they had no confidence in the system by which they ruled. They could scarcely then expect their fellow citizens to trust it either, or to come to its defense when it was under threat from forces outside the Directory 2 years later. Meanwhile, however, Fructidor ushered in a period of decisive government. The whole of the year 5, October 1796 to September 1797, had been a time of paralysis and suspended action. During its first half, the coming election had dominated all preoccupations. Its second was stalemated by the results. But now, with a united Directory and a subservient legislature, the government could turn to the problems shelved over the previous 12 months. First, the international situation was clarified. Both the Austrians and the British had been happy to spin out peace negotiations in the hope of wringing concessions from a divided France. They now saw no further prospect of that. Within 6 weeks, the Austrians had signed the Peace of Campo Formio, accepting conditions much like those agreed at Leoben the previous spring. The British, meanwhile, were offered terms amounting to little more than complete surrender, and broke off their negotiations within a week of the Fructidor coup. The whole French war effort was now to be marshaled against the island state, and Bonaparte was summoned back from Italy to command an army of invasion being encamped along the Channel coasts. Hoche, who had always regarded the British Isles as his destined prey, died suddenly late in September, removing the Corsican's last credible rival. Yet failure on the northern seas had almost destroyed Hoche in 1796. And the victor of Italy did not want to risk his own reputation. The Dutch fleet, an indispensable auxiliary, had been destroyed at Camperdown in October. An inspection of the northern ports quickly convinced him that no adequate expedition could be launched against England before the end of 1798. But did Great Britain need to be attacked frontally? As early as the summer of 1797, when he was still in Italy, Bonaparte had begun to dream of striking at a major source of British wealth, India, through Egypt. In September, while still in Italy, he had formally suggested the idea, and it appealed to Talleyrand, who, after a period of emigration, had re-emerged in July to become foreign minister. It appealed to the directors too, when the general and the minister formally proposed the idea of an Egyptian expedition on 5th March 1798. Bonaparte had behaved modestly since his return and refused to put on military airs, except when inspecting the troops in Normandy. But the presence at home of so successful a general, who had more than once forced the pace of the Republic's policies against the instructions of its directors, unnerved them. They would feel happier with him far away in Egypt, and the expedition he proposed was smaller and less expensive than a full-scale descent on England would have been. If he succeeded, the British would surely be knocked out of the war. They seemed too dependent on the wealth of India. And French control of the Suez Isthmus would turn their control of the route round the Cape from an asset into a burden. If he failed, they would be rid of him. Accordingly, the Directory welcomed the Egyptian project warmly. A fleet was equipped at Toulon over the spring of 1789. And on 19 May it sailed, carrying an army of 35,000 men. Fructidor also cleared the way for resolving the Republic's financial difficulties. Rommel, the finance minister, had survived in office throughout all the year five's political upheavals. But the collapse of paper money confronted him with problems scarcely less difficult than those it had caused. The disappearance of inflated paper provoked a massive deflation as still scarce coinage became once more the only legal tender. Debtors who had not already cleared their obligations in paper now found themselves overwhelmed as prices plummeted and interest rates soared. In many districts, a natural economy of barter proved the only viable means of exchange. Taxes, now payable in cash, practically dried up for a time, just as the moment when the government was brought face to face with the true scale of the debt it had run up to finance the war. The early months of 1797 witnessed desperate attempts to raise coinage from any source. Future revenues were mortgaged again. Advances at usurious rates, and the state's assets were recklessly sold off. From former church lands in now annexed Belgium right down to the crown jewels of the former kings. The main source of funds proved to be windfall income from the war indemnity payments from the Latvian Republic, or plunder from other conquered territories. Germany yielded 16 millions. Italy, all told, perhaps 200 millions. It all re-emphasized how dependent the Republic had now become on its generals. Yet, it was still not enough. And in the build-up to the Fructidor coup, Rommel's administration and the speculators on whom he relied to put together some of his more bizarre financial expedients were ferociously denounced in the councils. The main critics were among those purged. Within a week of their elimination, Rommel had radical and decisive remedies to propose, and the Directory adopted them. On 30th of September, 2/3 of the state's debts were renounced by a one-off payment in paper, valid for the purchase in national lands. The other third was consolidated. Not since 1770, except momentarily in August 1778, had the French government declared bankruptcy. And throughout the Revolution, a rare consensus had survived that the national debt should be sacrosanct. Without it, the revolution itself might not have come about, and it was a symbol of confidence in the new order. In Fructidor, the abandonment of the revolution's longest-held principle looked like one more admission of failure. Bitter debt holders found in subsequent months that the bonds in which they had been paid off lost 60% of their face value within a year. And soon afterwards, a decision no longer to accept them in payment for national lands completely destroyed them. But the 2/3 bankruptcy relieved the state of debts which cost it 160 millions a year and paved the way for durable financial reconstruction. The process began only a few weeks later, 12th November, with the establishment of an agency for direct contributions to orchestrate the recovery of direct taxes at local level via the directorial commissioners, the first centralized fiscal apparatus since the old regime, largely staffed too with officials who had learned their trade then and their methods. Taxpayers in arrears would find troops billeted on them. In 1798, another principle of the Revolution was abandoned with the reintroduction of the indirect taxes so universally execrated in the cahiers. It had been their very effectiveness that had made them unpopular, and which now constituted their appeal. They were now imposed on tobacco, on road traffic, on legal documents, and on doors and windows. Although the councils balked at a proposal to tax salt, with its echoes of the most hated of all the pre-revolutionary levies, the gabelle, none of these measures gave spectacularly rapid results. It took years to draw as much coinage back into circulation as had been available in 1789. And although the last years of the century were marked by good harvests, business confidence was slow to revive. The most immediate effect of the bankruptcy and the state's reviving capacity for taxing its citizens was to increase its unpopularity among the very property groups on which it claimed to base its support. Nor were the latter reassured by the politics of the directors after Fructidor. The purge of the councils and annulment of the elections proved only the beginning of a directorial terror, as some called it, lasting many months. Laws against émigrés were reactivated, and those who had returned with the revived royalist hopes of the spring were given 2 weeks to leave the country on pain of death. Over the next few months, 160 were put to death under this or older unrepealed laws. Now, for the first time in the whole revolution, nobles as a category were condemned by a law which deprived them of French citizenship merely for being noble. Little was done to implement this draconian measure, which would have made Barras and Bonaparte, to mention others, legally into foreigners. But laws against refractory priests, on the verge of abrogation before the coup, were now reactivated. And any cleric who refused to swear a new oath of hatred for royalty passed the day after the coup, made himself liable to summary deportation to Guyana. The revival of organized religion had made steady progress since the breakthrough of the spring of 1795. And even during leftward swings such as that after Vendémiaire, the central government had not enough authority in the localities to arrest the recovery. With the royalist surge of the year 5, many priests who had immigrated returned, and there were plenty of congregations ready to welcome them and provide them with a living. Fructidor proved a rude blow to them. Many who did not leave the country once more were rounded up, and of these only a small number took the oath of hatred. 10,000 refused it, thus making themselves liable to deportation, although 4/5 of these were in Belgian departments. In these newly annexed territories, it was seen as too dangerous to provoke a sullen population with mass deportations. Nevertheless, 1,400 non-jurors in all were sent to the western islands of Ré and Oléron prior to embarkation for Guyana. British ships rescued some of those sent on to the penal colony, so that eventually only 230 arrived there. But those interned included many who had been too old or ill to evade arrest, and they died on Ré or Oléron. Meanwhile, the directors sought to encourage less subversive cults, while the relics of the ill-starred constitutional church were left to wither away, which, however, they refused to do, largely thanks to the organizing energy of Grégoire. The anti-clerical La Réveillère gave his support to theophilanthropy, originating late in 1796. This movement of intellectual Republican deism prospered in towns where de-Christianization had been popular. After Fructidor, it was allocated former churches for its services, and La Réveillère saw to it that the best and most prominent ones in Paris, including for a time Notre Dame, came its way. But it never commanded much popular support, any more than it proved possible to stamp out the observation of Sundays in favor of the décadis of the Republican calendar. The renewed official anti-Catholicism, however, was warmly welcomed by Jacobins who, after 18 months in the wilderness, suddenly found themselves once more in modest favor. Although a small band of self-styled sans-culottes from eastern Paris presenting themselves for service on 18 Fructidor had been sternly told to disperse. With royalism perceived as the main danger, it was inevitable that the triumvirate should now look again leftwards for support. New elections were, after all, due in April 1798, when the last of the convention's perpetuals would retire. If another royalist triumph was to be avoided, proven anti-royalists would have to be mobilized. So, immediately after the coup, clubs were once more allowed to meet. And within weeks, constitutional circles were being formed in most of the departments. Not all by any means could be described as Jacobin. The directors saw them as rallying points for all sound Republican opinion. But inevitably, with suspicion of royalism so prevalent, most of those prepared to take a public stand had pasts tainted with terrorism, de-Christianization, or democracy. Inevitably, too, with their ranks decimated by repeated persecution since 1794, they sought to win new converts among working men. Thus, for example, although the circle set up at Evreux in February 1798 committed itself only to demonstrate the advantages of a free and popular government, to develop the wise and immutable principles of the Constitution, and to confer public office only on upright, virtuous, modest, patriotic, and enlightened men. A local official reported of it to the Minister of the Interior. I recognize among them good Republicans, but also persons whom I have heard declare in front of over 100 people that Babeuf was murdered at Vendôme. The language of social resentment so instinctively used by the democratic press, which revived in the new atmosphere, was also closely watched. As the elections approached, the more outspoken constitutional circles and neo-Jacobin journals began to be closed down. In Paris, that included the Left Bank Rue du Bac Club, which was calling for electoral reform which would radically widen the franchise established in 1795. For the Second Directory had no interest in enlarging the electorate. It still sought to base itself on decent folk, honnête gens, and substantial men of property. The problem was that too many of such people remained attracted by royalism. Yet no less than 437 seats, including those left vacant after Fructidor, had now to be filled. So, if anything, even more was at stake than in 1797. Blatant steps were therefore taken to rig the outcome at every stage. While lists of official candidates were established, the outgoing councils declared their intention to verify the results. Careful steps were taken to monitor the political complexion of every department, and government supporters and local officials were encouraged to foment splits in electoral assemblies whose inclinations looked dubious, so as to allow the councils to decide on the legitimacy of the rival factions and their candidates. Such splits had taken place in every election since 1789, somewhere or other. But in 1798, they occurred in over a quarter of the departmental electoral assemblies, 27 in all, and in even more of the primary ones. The results showed that attempts to damp down the Jacobin revival had come too late. In many districts, the constitutional circles packed the primary assemblies and secured the defeat of directorial candidates, notably in Paris and a number of major cities. Not surprisingly, then, former members of the convention did much better than in the previous year. 162 were elected, 71 of them regicides. Electors were not deterred by directorial talk of an unholy pact between the two political extremes. Royalism in a red cap. Royalism made no significant showing. Government supporters carried 43 departments, but it was not considered enough. As soon as all the results were in, accordingly, the process of checking began and deciding on split returns. But there was so many difficult cases that the elaborate process of scrutiny promised to last beyond the meeting date of the new legislature, set for 20th May, First Prairial, year number 6. The law of 22nd Floreal, 11th May, therefore, imposed a cutoff. 127 deputies were purged from the legislature before even taking their seats. The results from 8 departments were completely quashed, and only those in 47 out of 96 were allowed to stand untouched. 19 secessionist minorities had their candidates accepted, and runners-up were declared elected in other instances. 86 identifiable Jacobin winners were Florealized, along with a number of newly chosen local officials. The effect was to maintain firm directorial control on the councils, and chance helped sustain their authority too. François de Neufchâteau, the least forceful of the directors, drew the lot to retire. He was replaced by Traillard, a noted anti-clerical who reinforced the solidarity of the other 4. The coup of Floreal was less spectacular than that of Fructidor, and less decisive too. Within a year, significant numbers of those admitted as reliable had turned against the directors, but for the moment, it perpetuated the executive's control of the legislature asserted in Fructidor. If only by denying, for the second time in a year, the electorate's right to choose its own representatives. Some historians think that a viable parliamentary opposition might have developed in an unpurged legislature in 1798 and 99, seeing little evidence that the Jacobins still aimed, in contrast to the Royalists the year before, at the overthrow of the Constitution itself. But they were men with a bloody record, which inspired no trust in those they now denounced as oligarchs. To allow them a central power base seemed to imperil the Republican middle way which the directors saw as their overriding duty to uphold. Nor, as two unresisted coups had now shown, did they have much difficulty in doing so. An electorate largely disinclined to vote in the first place raised little protest when the results of votes were overridden. The relaxation of the central grip on the localities between 1794 and 98 had restored some of the local autonomy whose loss had caused such resentment in the year number 2. And peace with victory met a deep-felt aspiration in the aftermath of Floreal. Therefore, a triumphant directory faced the future with some confidence. Too much confidence, in fact. Within 12 months, sated with success, it would deliberately throw away most of these advantages. The most fateful mistakes occurred in foreign affairs. Nowhere was the arrogance of the Directory more flagrantly displayed. Having routed all continental enemies, the French now increasingly spoke of themselves as the great nation, superior in kind to all others, and entitled for that reason to behave according to their own rules. Bonaparte, in announcing the terms of Campo Formio in the Directory, was preaching to the convinced when he condemned the Italians as unworthy peoples who have little love for liberty and whose tradition, character, and religion cause them to hate us profoundly. You have succeeded, he later declared to the directors, in organizing the great nation whose vast territory it is circumscribed only because nature herself has imposed limits to it. They believed it, and the way in which others rushed to do their will after the fighting was over only confirmed their arrogance. At the Congress of Rastatt, convened to settle peace terms between France and the Holy Roman Empire, matters moved slowly because of the sheer complexity of the empire. But by April 1798, the Germans had been browbeaten into agreeing to allow the left bank of the Rhine to be incorporated within France's self-proclaimed natural frontiers, and condoning the secularization of ecclesiastical states to provide compensation for those who lost by that process. In January 1798, meanwhile, a French-backed coup had overthrown the age-old government of the Swiss Confederation, substituting yet another sister republic, the Helvetic. In August, a treaty of alliance gave France perpetual free access to the Alpine passes. In Italy, too, there were French advances. Bonaparte had shown that reputations could be made there, and lesser generals left behind were keen to emulate him. They were encouraged by the renewed anti-clericalism of the Directory after Fructidor to bully the Pope and infiltrate Italian Jacobins from the north into his territories. A riot in Rome on 28 December 1797 accidentally led to the death of a French general. It was used as a pretext for invading the Papal States. And on 15 February, in a holy city occupied by French troops, a group of Jacobins proclaimed the Roman Republic and were at once recognized. The Pope was taken prisoner, that same Pius VI, whose condemnation of the civil constitution of the clergy had precipitated France's religious troubles. In increasingly delicate health, he spent the next 18 months being bundled from one place of captivity to another before dying on French soil at Valence in August 1799. Such displays of power could only alarm the rest of Europe, especially Austria, whose Italian gains at Campo Formio seemed already threatened by continued French expansion into the peninsula. But nothing did more to turn alarm into resistance than the Egyptian expedition. Conceived as a project without cost, its initial military record was indeed impressive. Sailing on 17 May, on 12 June, Bonaparte took Malta, dissolved the Order of the Knights of St. John, and garrisoned it with French troops. On 2nd July, he arrived in Egypt and took Alexandria by storm. On the 21st, he defeated the Mameluke army at the Battle of the Pyramids, and a few days later was in Cairo, the master of Egypt. Another campaign of lightning brilliance, but it was reduced to nothing on 1st August, when the fleet which had conveyed the expedition was smashed to pieces by Nelson in what the British remember as the Battle of the Nile. The British had withdrawn from the Mediterranean in 1797. To send a fleet back there was a gamble, and it took Nelson weeks to find the French. But when he did, he showed that not even their greatest commander was invulnerable. He cut off thousands of their best troops in the east and provided the vital impulse for the formation of a new European coalition against France. Outraged by the unprovoked invasion of what was, however, nominally Ottoman territory. The Turks declared war on France as soon as they heard about Nelson's victory. Militarily, this meant little, but so great was the fury in Constantinople that the hitherto unthinkable was allowed. A Russian fleet passed through the Bosporus, sailing to attack Corfu, a French possession since Campo Formio. For all Catherine II's posturings, Russia had never yet taken the field against revolutionary France. But after she died in 1796, her unstable son Paul I looked for opportunities to make his counter-revolutionary mark. Already incensed by being ignored at the Congress of Rastatt, which was redrawing the map of Germany without consulting him, in violation of rights recognized since 1779, he boiled over with fury at the seizure of Malta, of which he had declared himself the protector in 1797. He was also concerned at reports that the French were making trouble in Poland, so he, too, rushed to declare his hand when news broke of Nelson's victory. So did the Neapolitans, deeply shocked by the French takeover of the Papal States and a series of threats which followed it. The Bourbon government in Naples was elated by the arrival of the victorious Nelson in September. He urged them to join the rapidly coalescing new alliance. Noting the weakness of the French garrison in Rome, they were anxious to strike before any reinforcements arrived. And in November, their troops marched north against the new sister republic. They reached Rome and occupied it, led by an Austrian general. They signed an offensive alliance with the Russians, but at the first clash with French troops, they turned and fled. Championnet, the French commander, saw Bonaparte like opportunities opening up, and pursued them back to Naples, which the royal family abandoned on 23rd December, sailing off to Sicily with Nelson. On 26 January 1799, Championnet proclaimed the Parthenopean Republic. He proved to be no Bonaparte, and he was not dealing with the divided Directory of 1796. They now wanted to take on yet another unstable and rootless puppet state. He was relieved of his command. But the damage was done. By this time, Russia had sought and received permission for her troops to cross Austrian territory, going to the aid of their southern ally. By the end of the year, an army of 11,000 Russians was on the Austrian soil. Not unnaturally, the French regarded their presence as a hostile sign, and on 2nd January 1799 they issued an ultimatum for their removal. The Austrians did not respond, and in March war was formally declared. The emperor joined the network of treaties which over the preceding months had pulled most of the still independent powers of Europe together into a second anti-French coalition. At Rastatt, where negotiations to settle the last details of the Peace of Campo Formio still meandered on, 2 French delegates were hacked to death by Austrian soldiers on 22nd April. A new war to destroy the French Revolution had clearly begun. The renewal of continental warfare, after barely a year's respite, received no welcome in France. The shattering naval defeat, which announced the general resumption of the struggle, signaled that the time of apparently effortless victory was over. The scale of the renewed effort likely to be required was spelled out with the passage on September 5, 1798, as the international horizon darkened, of the Jourdan Law on conscription, a new word with a long future. The numbers in the armies had fallen steadily since the year number 2. By 1798, there were only 270,000 Frenchmen under arms. It had taken well over 1 million to fend off the previous coalition. The new law, devised by the victor of Wattignies and Fleurus, reiterated the principle of the levée en masse, that all citizens were at the Republic's disposition in times of emergency. Army numbers were to be made up by volunteers in the first instance. But if they proved insufficient, young men between 20 and 25 were to be drafted to make up the numbers. From registers drawn up by local authorities, an annual class would be called to arms. The last time military service had been imposed, it had triggered off the uprising in the Vendée and Civil War. Then, as now, the government imposing it had been violently anti-clerical, scorning popular religious feelings, and its response to defiance and defeat had been one of terror. The Directory seemed to be bringing the revolution full circle, with no prospect of a stable and durable settlement of the problems which, for the best part of a decade, had torn France and much of Europe too apart. In the course of the ensuing year, even the Army, which had hitherto sustained and defended the Directory, would come to this dispiriting conclusion. Then the end of the revolution would at last be in sight. That's the end of chapter 14.